Good evening and welcome to another Maclean's Live. My name is Paul Wells. I'm a senior writer at Maclean's Magazine, coming to you live from my living room as I have every week since this madness began. What a long, strange trip it's been. It was in April when we first started doing these weekly online discussions with distinguished guests about the details of this pandemic, about the way we're living our lives in spite of this pandemic. And so I think it's appropriate that we end with a very high-level discussion of the current state of play. As we end our weekly webcasts for now, we'll be back in the fall. But as we head into a long summer break, I think it's good that we have two guests as distinguished as the ones that we have joining us tonight. I should say, first of all, that we are grateful, as always, to the Canadian Bankers Association for sponsoring these weekly get-togethers, and to our partners at the National Arts Centre, who have been helping to bring these conversations to you since the old days when we used to have them in person in a live venue, a situation we hope we can get back to replicating very quickly. And my two guests tonight will be the ones who can tell us a little bit about how that's likely to go. A few weeks ago, the Prime Minister named a high-level immunology task force, which is tasked with finding out the safest and best circumstances under which we can finally all get out of our caves and get back to seeing one another face to face. Two of the members of that task force are with us here tonight. Dr. Catherine Hankins is a professor of public and population health at McGill University. And before that, going back to the 1980s, she has been one of Canada's leading researchers into HIV and AIDS. She joins us from Montreal. Kate Hankins, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
And joining us from Toronto is David Naylor, who is a former president of the University of Toronto. He's now back to earning an honest living as a professor of medicine at UofT. He wrote the federal government, he led the federal government appointed panel into the 2003 SARS outbreak that was at its worst in Toronto. That report led to the formation of the Public Health Agency of Canada. He has since then, at intervals, written a series of reports into our healthcare system, into our science and research infrastructure, all of which were very partially implemented by the governments to which he submitted the reports. And we're really glad that he's here tonight. He just knows a little bit about everything, and so we're really glad to have him. Dr. Hankins, let's start. Maybe you can explain the mandate of this immunology task force, what it is that you all are trying to do, and what sort of work have you been doing on this task up till now?
So it's called the COVID-19 Immunity Task Force, and it was announced April 23rd by the Prime Minister, and he said it pretty succinctly that we would try to find out who had been infected, how long any kind of immunity that might be conferred by infection lasts. And so that's what we're trying to do. We have several working parties that are working on getting the tests standardized and validated. Another working party that's looking at the field studies that we need to do, both in the general population and in specific priority populations. And then we have an immune science working party that's looking at, well, how does the body respond and what can we measure that shows us what the response is, and then how long do those last, and do they confer ongoing immunity against a second infection? So that's grosso modo what we're trying to do.
Dr. Naylor, so basically we're trying to figure out once I've had the disease, how do I know that I've had it, and how sure can I be that that means I won't be getting it again? Surely this is work that is being repeated in various forums around the world right now. Why a Canadian task force, and to what extent are you doing your work in conjunction with basically a whole world of science outside Canada?
Great question. First of all, each region will have a unique seroprevalence. That's probably true within Canada. We'll see the cities where we've had major outbreaks uh, uh, showing the highest background seroprevalence. Montreal, Toronto would be obvious candidates for higher numbers. But also, we would expect in some of the rural and remote areas, lower seroprevalence, because some of them have been spared, many, fortunately. So you need to have numbers that are specific to the context. Those numbers in turn can give you a sense of just what the vulnerability is, assuming, and this is a big assumption, that the antibodies that we measure are correlated, as Kate said, with some degree of immunity or protection. And that's really something still being confirmed, part of our job with others. And then as to the global scene, everyone is working flat out, not only to get those numbers for their jurisdiction, but also to have some sense of where the science is going. And we're plugged into various international networks just simply because of the connections of people we have on the task force. This is a global conversation. I've never seen one unfold at this pace or with this intensity in my entire career. And I think we not only see institutional barriers coming down and rivals collaborating freely and on a friendly basis within this country, but we also see a level of global exchange that is totally unprecedented. It has downsides. The preprint servers are humming. They put up a lot of great stuff that turns up in the best journals. They also put up some material that doesn't withstand long-term scrutiny. So that's a downside, but to see all that material pouring out, to see the major journals turning material around in no time is fantastic, because it means that even if you don't have time to pick up the phone or send an email to a close colleague in Sweden or Brazil or wherever, you're going to see the stuff online very quickly. So it's a brave new world.
By preprint servers, you mean papers that are going online without yet having been rigorously fact-checked, peer-reviewed. People have not yet kicked the tires on this research to be absolutely sure that you can hang your hat on it. And that means there's a lot of noise in the signal, I guess.
You got it. That's exactly what's happening, Paul. And the good news, as I said, is that when it comes out of fantastic groups, you see it instantly, sometimes with press releases, which is a little unsporting, but you do see this stuff quickly. And the tires are often kicked by the community of peers even before the material heads off to a journal. So that helps.
Okay. Kate Hankins, I often hear people say that the goal we're looking for is herd immunity, the idea that gently, and maybe not all in a rush, once enough of us have had this virus run through our systems, then we're good to go. Is it that simple?
No, in a nutshell.
That was a bit of a setup, that question.
In the first place, there's a lot of debate about what herd immunity would mean. Would it mean like 60 to 70% of people would have had it? Secondly, we don't even know if you had it once, if you are protected. And thirdly, I don't want to call it collateral damage, but you're going to lose a lot of people. You're going to have a lot of people die, and you're going to have a lot of people with these, it's like a long tail, the people that are getting infected and then are having ongoing inflammatory syndromes, having dialysis, it's not just affecting lungs. This is a very serious infection if you get it. If you're one of those people that doesn't just sort of, and again, we have so much to learn. There's lots of questions about whether there's a genetic predisposition to the severe form. We know that, people with hypertension, with diabetes, with obesity, they're more likely, people that are living in crowded social housing, the people who are constantly being exposed occupationally. There's the social determinants of risk for getting this are very important. But I think, we can't just say, well, let it run wild. I think the UK thought they would do that in the beginning, and they really lost valuable time. So I'm not a proponent of herd immunity. I am keenly wanting a vaccine and very pleased to see how much activity there is going on about a vaccine, because I can't see how we get out of this without a vaccine. I don't know if David thinks we can get out without a vaccine, but that's my personal view.
I just jump in. Yeah, I just jump in and say, I agree completely with Kate's formulation. You know, that one of the risks, as implied by Kate's comments, is if you let this burn through a population, it's not just the elderly who are differentially targeted, but there's a very strong socioeconomic differential tied partly to comorbidity, diabetes, obesity, other chronic diseases that are more prevalent. But frankly, things as basic as housing, then the consequences of joblessness that have other health effects that are very long-term. So we do have to be smart about containing the spread of this virus in the short and medium term, just for all kinds of good reasons that are not simply about those who are infected, but the overall societal consequences. The other thing I guess I'd say in response to the vaccine issue is, I believe the game will change a bit here once we have some effective treatments. And we're just starting to see the beginning of some things that look as though they have promise, which is very encouraging. The antivirals are so far, but we are seeing things as simple as high-dose steroids or some of the anti-inflammatories that are monoclonal antibodies appear to mitigate the severe forms of the disease. No panacea is here, but changes in mortality that are encouraging. We also know there's a huge number of groups working with monoclonal antibodies. And this is where you have bespoke antibodies that are designed to neutralize the virus or to make it a more inviting target for immune cells to destroy it. Both can come into play. And so the use of these monoclonals really has promise for a couple of reasons. One is they can mitigate the disease, but secondly, they will be a signpost for us as to how vaccines might be designed that will be effective. So I think the next phase is likely to be, early work with vaccines. It's already bubbling, as Kate said, all over the world. But also, we're going to start seeing, I would think in the weeks ahead, not months, the results of some of the trials of these bespoke antibodies that could attack the virus or help the body fight off the virus. And I think they have great promise of being a bridge to a vaccine, as well as making the disease less scary, more manageable. So we'll see if that's where it goes, but I've got my fingers crossed, and that's what I'm hoping for.
Okay. How does remdesivir, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, fit into that constellation of therapies that you just described? This is the medicine that the Americans have been buying up quite aggressively, all the stocks that they can get their hands on.
Yeah, so that's an antiviral. The trials suggest that it has a modest effect. I'm intrigued that they're betting the farm on it. I don't know that I would recommend that to the government of Canada. And it's also not exactly sporting behavior, but that's been a bit of a specialty there for a while now. Yeah. So it's an antiviral, Paul. It's in the category of compounds that attack the virus and disable it. And as I said, if you think of it, you can do the ones that are anti-inflammatory and affect the body's adverse response to the virus. Kate referred to the fact that that may be genetic. You can do things that attack the virus with various chemical messengers. You can use antibodies as a biological vector to attack the virus. There are different ways to deal with this disease. And I do think we'll see antivirals that are more effective, but that particular one is so-so in my view.
Okay. Kate Hankins, how likely is it that the vaccine that will work, that we will end up all taking in a year or 8 months or 20 months, already exists and is in trials now? Or are people still trying to cook the vaccine that will eventually work? Is it just that the trial period is
such an easy question.
I heard you guys were smart.
Well, you're asking this. I remember, in HIV, I think it was in 1989, the Secretary of Health in the US said there'd be a vaccine in 2 years for HIV. So I'm very, very cautious about predicting, but I do know that it's unlikely that it would be one vaccine. There are several different types of vaccines being tested, and I think probably there'll be more than one that gets approved and goes into manufacturing. And we hear different, we have teams working here in Canada. I'm aware of what's going on in the US and their time frame, and they're talking about big trials. 30,000 people would be in the trials, people that would be more likely to be exposed as well. So, they're saying they hope to be able to mount those trials by the end of 2020, and then we'll see how fast they can get results. But so I'm not predicting a time frame. I'm just saying it's going to be more than one vaccine would be what I would predict.
Okay. And as you mentioned, I mean, there still is nothing resembling a vaccine for HIV. But in prosperous societies, there's a sort of various cocktails of therapies that have a fantastic success in prolonging life and increasing comfort and stuff like that. Is that one of the things that we're aiming for with this virus, or would we really like to be able to knock it out?
I don't think we're thinking of it as being a chronic infection. I think it's going to be, what we're trying to do is deal with the acute infection and end it more rapidly before people get into this downward spiral in terms of the treatment. So I don't think it's not going to be like HIV where you have it for life. You will have sequelae potentially for life, meaning that you may have kidney damage or some other damage that you carry forward if you've been severely affected. But the infection itself is not going to stay on in the body as HIV does.
Okay. Let me ask you a bit about your experience with HIV back in the day and how it helps to frame your experience with this very different threat today. I mean, so you've been doing pandemics since before pandemics were cool. How did that arm you up for this current battle?
It was interesting because this first came to my attention, in terms of my professional life, when a student at a university in Ontario had posted some information about the virus. This was very early on. This was in January, and just thought it would be good to remind people to wash hands and stuff like that. Very, very, very early on, before we actually had cases. We had February 1st, when I started writing about this, we had 4 cases in Canada, which is incredible when you think about it now. And her concern was stigma. It was anti-Asian stigma. She had heard people at the university saying things, and it made me realize right from the get-go, wherever this is going to go, we're going to have these issues. We're going to have stigma, we're going to have discrimination, we're going to have to be very alert and aware of those kinds of, and we've seen it in, in certain cities in Canada where, people are saying, go home to Indigenous people that look like they might be Asian to people, we really do need to be thinking about it. And we have to think as well, when we eventually get into looking at immune status and whether it confers any benefit, do we see this being parlayed into being able to access work that people can't get? I mean, there are many, many ethical issues we need to be thinking about. And that HIV was very much like that. It really, in the same way that HIV found those fault lines and has found this virus has found the fault lines in terms of vulnerabilities and so on, it also has created a response that we need to be very careful about and intentional about ensuring that people don't get discriminated against and that we deal with the stigma and get rid of it.
I'd just add to that, Paul, something about a fault line that probably wasn't there with HIV, but is really starting, I think, to emerge, and that is an intergenerational fault line. Younger people, as we know, although people in their 20s have lost their lives to this virus, fare relatively well. Many are asymptomatic or have mild disease. And a situation where a lockdown is imposed and young people feel that this is impeding their chance to, have the glory years of their lives, as it were, or where they're being prevented from finding opportunities to work or to complete schooling. All those things, I think, breed a certain intergenerational resentment. And if you think about it right now, the millennials are entering a job market that was already tough and competitive. They're dealing with a world where climate change is being ceded to them by the generosity of our generation. They're a generation that in general actually has had less higher education than the preceding one. That's almost unprecedented. That has more student debt, he says the former university president with a bad conscience. I mean, there is an intergenerational element here that is, I think, going to emerge the longer there's constraint on the economy, the longer that there's restraint on civil society. So that one wasn't there before, but we're seeing that now. It's interesting.
You and I have actually talked about this before, the idea that climate change is essentially a raw intergenerational deal. The debts that are piling up, the government debts that are piling up as we deal with this, as governments must with this immediate crisis, is a raw intergenerational deal. And the sort of wholesale foreclosing of what could have been the best education, the fact that everyone's doing this instead of going and hanging out with teachers and learning the way you might hope that would happen, that's all a major challenge. And at the other end of it is, I think the real surprise that everyone had that long-term care would be absolutely a focal point of where this virus would attack and have its effect. So a lot of the commentators who said, let's just go outside and take our hit and do the best we can and get our herd immunity are between those younger generations that are paying and those older generations that are dying. And it's a little cheap for guys my age to say it's not such a big deal. Now, it's me who said that, not you, but I wonder whether you would concur.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I would say that just on seniors facilities, long-term care homes, nursing homes, it's painful to look at this because I think anyone looking back would see that pattern was established in Europe as the pandemic swept through the continent. We saw the same thing. Furthermore, if you look back, pandemic plans generally highlight when they focus on flu, but another respiratory virus, obviously, the vulnerability of those types of seniors facilities. That's been recognized for a long time. I was digging the other day and trying to see when there was first a sort of concatenation of flu and outbreaks in nursing homes turning up in the medical literature. You see it all over in the 80s and 90s. In fact, the first report I found online was in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, a letter from 1978, when there were already recognized flu outbreaks in nursing homes and vaccines were being used to try to mitigate the problem. So this isn't a new insight. And it remains, I think, for many people, a kind of puzzling tragedy that in country after country this happened and somehow it never percolated into consciousness in a way that led to the proper precautions. And you talk about intergenerational issues and the fault lines in society. There's a fault line that really in one society after another has come to the fore. And I think is likely, or at least I hope, is going to cause some change in how we do business in that sector. So lots of fault lines, lots of multi-generational issues. And yeah, all those folks in their 40s and 50s are definitely the villains of the piece.
I just want to say, Paul, that there has to be a major stock taking about long-term care.
Yeah.
Because Canada is an outlier in terms of the proportion of deaths that have happened. 81% of our deaths have been in long-term care. And you see quite distinct differences by province. And I think we need to look by province at what are the standards in long-term care? How many people in a room? We saw this where we discovered people are so poorly paid as personal support workers that they're going between different facilities. That was picked up right away in BC and stopped. It didn't transfer, that lesson, that learning didn't transfer to Quebec fast enough. I think we need to really pull back and take a close look at this. I mean, if we look at women in Canada, like it's quite striking, men are supposed to be more in the sense at risk of getting ill and dying with this. And we're seeing, about the same mortality in men and women, but more women affected. And that's because more women are in long-term care and more women are in caregiving roles. So I think there's a real need to look at that gender fault line, but also to look at what kind of safety and quality of life are we giving our seniors in the way in which our society constructs care for the elderly. It's a big question that we need to address.
Yeah, we've talked for years in Canada about the advantage of having a federal, provincial, territorial set of systems is that you have natural experiments, you have a certain amount of pluralism. And yet because we have this NIH syndrome, the not invented here syndrome, there's a kind of strange blinkered refusal to look across even provincial boundaries and learn from what's gone right and what's gone wrong. And I think we've seen this, as Kate said, in this where the pandemic's touched down in Canada, but we've seen it for years in many other areas of healthcare policy and policy making. So I think the stock taking is necessary. And I hope there'll be a broader stock taking about how we deliver healthcare in general, and maybe a little bit more attention to what we can learn from each other, and as we look out a few years.
But it can be infernally hard to get public authorities concentrating on the fundamentals, especially between crises, right? Like, I'm already hearing voices that say that what the most exciting thing about a hypothetical post-crisis period is that we can concentrate on building new infrastructure, that what this country really needs now is high-speed rail. And I'm like, you're skipping about 20 steps there. I mean, I not to single out Dalton McGuinty, but I went back in the middle of all this and read his memoir of his time as Premier of Ontario. There's no mention of long-term care. He was Premier for close to a decade. And maybe if he'd done stuff that would have been worth putting in his memoir, it would have helped. Over to you, Kate Hankins, in François Legault's Quebec.
Well, I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking more about if this is a reset, and it clearly is a major reset. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of thinking to do about how we deal with the background climate crisis, which has been going on, and people, there's less air travel and skies are cleaner and so on. But the level of heating up in the Arctic is really freaky. The fires that are going on up there in Siberia and other places, the fact that peat moss or peat is starting to melt and release methane gas. I mean, I don't want to go into it. I just want to say that this, because we're forced into the situation we're in now, we cannot take our eyes off that larger issue, which is still there and is still worsening. And it's an opportunity, I think, to really think through our consumption, our travel, decisions we make about how we handle waste, etc. There's a lot of different issues that I think we should be addressing. It's an opportunity.
So I'm thinking back to SARS and all the blather about the new normal. And that was the catchphrase, the new normal post-SARS. And I have a kind of split screen on this. Depends a bit on how much caffeine I've had or whether there's some alcohol on board, I think. One screen is that I see, as Kate has hoped for, a reset where we start to ask some hard questions about how things are, why they are not as they ought to be, and we actually focus on fixing some of them. Understanding that governments are going to be cash-strapped and that sort of hectic social engineering generally doesn't work too well, but there's some pretty obvious things that need fixing, and maybe this is the moment. So that's the optimistic view. But when I look back and you take other crises we've had, the inertia in the system is extraordinary. The sort of drive to get back to the way things were. They weren't that way because there weren't forces aligning them there. And those forces maybe in abeyance, but they haven't disappeared. So when people talk about reopening the economy, I'm sympathetic. We need to get people back to work. We need to get the economy rolling for the meaning and identity work gives, for the money it provides to let us rebuild the country. But I also worry that rush to get back to the way things were will make it harder for a reset to occur. And so I see that as a mixed blessing. And as I said, a split screen view here, depending on what side of the bed I get up on in the morning. I hope there's a reset. I hope it's constructive and smart. But I worry that the inertia of the system will take us right back where we've been. And that includes, of course, the chronic problem of public health, health protection, health emergency response, being cranked up for however long it takes to have the vaccine rolled out. And I believe we will be rolling one out in 2021. I'm an optimist about that. And then suddenly we'll go back into this view of, well, it's okay, we did well enough. Good enough is going to be good enough. And I would just say, as a sort of final note of caution on that front, not only are there areas that need a good look and a reset, like long-term care, but we really need to go back over public health, figure out what went right, what went wrong. And I think we can see from provincial variation and some of the areas where we lagged other countries that we probably still have some work to do there. And let's hope we just don't do a quick reset and move on that one, because that's also the pattern.
So over the last 15 years, both in the Canadian context and internationally, there's been a series of ever more refined plans for dealing with an unspecified catastrophe like the one we're in the middle of. Pandemic preparedness plans from Public Health Agency of Canada, from Centers for Disease Control, from the World Health Organization. In the end, was there a sense in which those plans constrained response as much as it inspired response?
I could maybe just say that, not having been here in the time of SARS, because I was overseas in Geneva at the time, that it seemed to me that we felt fairly confident here. Like, people pulled out the SARS playbook and we had the experience. We'd done it before. We could really make it work. And there was maybe perhaps just not enough humility in the beginning to think, did we have everything in there that we need? And I think long-term care was the obvious one that hadn't been really thought about. But that's just my view. David, you were here in SARS.
Yeah, I would say that we were definitely better prepared than for SARS. All kinds of things had more coherence. The machinery was certainly stronger. And what happened was the much anticipated big one materialized after decades. This is a once in a century type of event. And I think what we learned is that being prepared for another SARS was one thing. That was a limited outbreak. It touched down in one province and was contained, hit a couple of regions of another province, and then disappeared in months. This is very different. It's a much more insidious virus in so many ways. Probably lower case fatality, meaningfully lower, I think, by the end of all the calculations. But, higher infectivity and a lot of patterns of infection that make it just difficult to control. The immunity piece, which we may have time to talk about a little bit more, is also puzzling. It's more complicated than many people imagined on the immunity side. So you put an agent like that into play, and even if you've got a great SARS-derived playbook, even if you've got great pandemic influenza plans, what you realize is that the most important thing is not just the playbook, but the ability to rewrite it on the fly. And Paul, you and I have talked about this before. I think that comes down to not just the playbook, but the people who are leading the response. And you have to have public health emergency leaders who are not just going to follow the WHO playbook, or not just going to do what the playbook says on pandemic A or pandemic B. You have to have people who can improvise on the fly. And, the improvisers who followed the rules but also broke them a few times are the ones who've done best in this. And
Such as, who's
well,
best in class on that scale?
so I think, if you think about it, I'll go international to be tactful about Canada. There's Taiwan, which of course has the advantage of being an island, but which was alert to the fact that this was human-to-human transmission, no matter what was being said by the Chinese about it being limited, and were on high alert and who managed to contain this brilliantly. The Singaporeans who lived through SARS at close range had a bad outbreak. I was in close touch with them during the SARS outbreak in Toronto. Again, handled this much more effectively. South Korea, testing, tracing, masking, things that everyone else got onto later in the game. And so none of that was necessarily classic playbook stuff. There was a lot of skepticism about masking in many quarters for a long time, including coming from the folks in Geneva. And yet, although that wasn't proven by any randomized trials as the ticket, people went with their intuition that calling something droplet spread was kind of meaningless, because droplets can be small and can float in the air and be effectively functioning a bit like an airborne entity like measles. So they improvised and they did better. And we decided we'd be a little more, step by step. We didn't do as well.
You mentioned masking. The Republican governor of Texas today issued a mandatory mask order for all Texans in public. This is only a few months after there were some jurisdictions that were administering fines against people who use masks in a non-clinical context. If you wore a mask to the grocery store, you'd be in trouble. Dr. Hankins, have you ever seen the like of it? And can you help me understand how that 180 happened?
I've never seen the like of masks becoming a political statement. And that has been a real issue south of the border. That's been an amazing issue. I think the reversal that we're seeing is because they're getting back to square one. They're doing exactly what we don't want to do. You want to open carefully, track and monitor, jump on clusters, deal with things, make sure there's lots of testing available. They have the same kind of thing where each state can decide what it wants to do, but the leadership at the helm has been so defective. And I think that's just led to a complete breakdown in some states. And so what you're seeing now is we got to bring it back down. I know we're all concerned. There are over 50,000 cases a day now in the US. I certainly don't anticipate us opening our border July 21st. I can't imagine we would even think about it at this stage.
Yeah, I'd second that. I think the U.S. is a very major concern, and the potential for a lot of imported infection is deeply worrisome. I mean, more generally, as international travel resumes, we have this view that separating the seats with an empty middle seat is going to go by the by, and we'll just sort of pack everyone in like sardines in the old days. I mean, a lot of this, no matter what precautions are taken, causes one to be a little uneasy about just how well we're going to do over the next few months, and just whether Canada needs to be super cautious about how exactly we open up internationally. I know it's a globalized world. Everyone is traveling. Everyone wants to be in touch with people in other countries. Tourism's a hugely important industry for this country, so there's nothing easy here. I don't envy the folks making those decisions, but I do worry that allowing a lot of unimpeded, unchecked international travel, opening borders too easily without safeguards, quarantines, controls, All of that needs to be considered very, very carefully over the next few weeks. We need to go into the fall, with some jurisdictions showing a stream of cases. That I think we can all live with that. It's not optimal, but it is what it is. As long as we're not seeing exponential growth, that's fine. We'll manage. But to head into the fall, when there's going to be an interest in rules, I hope cautiously, when there'll be people starting to move indoors because of the cold weather, and we'll have more congregation of people just because of that climate change. All that leads me to be very worried about the fall being an uptick, and to go into it with the momentum heading in the wrong direction, because we've got a massive imported load of cases. That is highly suboptimal. That's not a good way to start in September, October. Big trouble ahead.
Okay, so things could turn markedly worse in the fall based on the circumstances that you're describing, or that's the sort of thing keeping you up at night.
Yeah, it keeps me up at night, Paul. We didn't get much climatic relief with this particular virus. It's burned along in humid weather and hot weather. The relief may be more to do with people being outdoors and simply, the dispersal of virus and aerosolized spread being mitigated. Plus people being spread out because they're outdoors. But this is one of those paradoxes. These viruses move along, the respiratory viruses in winter, in meaningful measure in cold climes because people are jammed together. And, this is an infectious agent. It's spread by droplets, including very small droplets that are partially aerosolized. There's a risk here.
Okay.
Paul, I just want to add one thing we do need to address, and that is, I'm thinking about the fall. There's always been this sort of, on the one hand, people that don't have sick leave going to work when they're sick. On the other hand, people who have it but don't want to use it and are heroic and I have to go to work. I think there's going to have to be a real change in the feeling of responsibility that you have to stay at home if you're not feeling well and not show up at work. That's just a point I want to make about the fall, because I think, we all know what happens at Christmas time, and the holidays, when people get influenza and other colds and stuff just circulating around because we're all coming together and, we're not isolating when we're ill. And I think the same thing with the work situation. We have to make sure that we don't go to work when we're sick.
No, it's a big
sick leave policies too.
Yeah, I just want to second that. I think the culture change is happening with masks. Very much something that was a pattern in East Asia. People wore masks to avoid making others sick. Obviously, they have some protective effect on the individual wearing them as well, but it was a gesture of good citizenship and consideration. And we're going to have to get bosses everywhere to tell people, please don't come to work, and to avoid this issue of consumption of sick days and docking pay and all those goofy things that are part of the sort of punitive approach to being off work, and try to reset that really hard, when we get into the fall. The economy is already picking up, so it probably should be reset now, but people who feel ill should be able to stay home without taking a hit, and should not feel compelled to turn up to work and put others at risk. Simply because of the conditions under which they're remunerated or the culture that's been created at their workplace. I agree with Kate 100%.
As you head into the summer, what are the big questions facing your task force over the summer and heading into the fall? David, you talked about the immunity piece itself is turning out to be more of a challenge than you thought it would be. How so? And what's your main work lying ahead?
So the sort of fantasy here was the antibodies are the answer. I'm doing a caricature here, obviously. The antibodies are the answer. They confer permanent immunity, or at least years of immunity. We'll measure the antibodies. They'll be around for a long time, so we'll find them no matter how long ago someone was sick. We'll get a real sense not just of the prevalence, but the background immunity by pretty direct inference. We'll be able to say who's at risk, who's not. Then you get into the really silly stuff with all the adverse social and ethical and legal consequences of saying, well, maybe we can tell people that they're certified immune, et cetera. So that was part of a sort of fantasy about measuring antibodies. And the reality is we still need to measure them. So, we'll look at the blood banks. We should have those results in a couple of weeks, a scan of the country, and certainly an initial national average, and then more granular data. We've got to look at some of the priority populations that Kate referenced earlier. There's several of those that we're getting on with. But in the background, the question for us is, what do the antibody titers mean? And I think what we're starting to see is that it may be more complicated, that the cellular side of immunity is important, and that it has the potential to be, not only adjunctive, because antibodies and cells can work together, but maybe a primary defense mechanism, as well as a primary source of memory if there's a re-challenge with the virus for large numbers of people, particularly those who've had mild or asymptomatic disease. So, we've gone from, and I don't think anyone saw this simplistically, but I think perhaps some were thinking of it this way early on, not in Canada, I'm glad to say. We've gone from this fantasy about antibody-derived immunity passports to a much more nuanced and complicated view of how to measure immunity. And we're going to have to figure that out over the next number of weeks and months. And all over the world, people are working on this flat out. They're trying to figure out which antibodies matter, because they're not all the same. Figure out how the cells come into it. Figure out how much of it is the response to the virus that is conditioned by exposure, and how much of it is that some people have immunity because of other coronaviruses, or what's called innate immunity, which is just the way we're all set up to react to anything foreign. It's great for protecting, the oropharynx, and clearly protect some people from getting the bad case of COVID that leads to severe lung disease and the rest of it. So lots of work to do here to figure out immunity, and lots of measurement to do of the basic antibody screens and refine them and improve them, but a really serious science agenda worldwide on translating all of that insight into something that we can use, practically speaking, to understand who's vulnerable and who's not. The last piece of the puzzle is that may turn out to be very important with the vaccine. There are people who are saying, we want vaccines to be measured not just in terms of the antibody response, but to be able to look at the immune cells, not just the B cells, which produce the antibodies, but at the so-called T cells and others in that white blood cell line, to see how they are tuned by a vaccine to be more responsive to this particular virus. So, it's fascinating science. Every time you think you've got something nailed with this virus, a wrinkle or a challenge pops up. This is an insidious, complex organism, just 15 genes, but it's a world of trouble and complexity to sort out.
So to sum up, it sounds like we're moving very rapidly away from a world where it'd be sort of red card, green card. I can go out, but you can't yet, to a much more nuanced and layered picture where you're playing the angles, playing the percentages, rather than knowing for sure whether you're safe.
Yeah, and I think that's on one level that's challenging and frustrating. On the other hand, we weren't going to burn through to herd immunity in any rational universe. So there were never going to be in any country vast numbers of people holding up that green card, the get out of jail card, number one. But number two, as Kate said earlier, what kind of world would it be where a bunch of people ran around with the green card because they just happened to have been infected with the virus and done well, and everyone else is sitting there saying, what about me? What is that a reasonable way to organize your society and have a successful, useful society that some measure of equity and decency? I think the answer is it's not a very pretty picture to imagine the sort of world of immuno-bigotry, if you will. So Probably okay that it's complicated, even though we all would like it to be simple.
There's just two quick
Dr.
things I
Hankins?
want to say. One is that, you know, HIV just expanded the field of immunology so much. You know, the last 25 years of working on HIV has led to huge development in our understanding of the immune system. So at least we have that base to build on, which is good. And David's absolutely right. This is complicated, and it's more complicated just when we think something, then we find something else. You know, the second thing is and this is the positive thing, we have not seen proven reinfections. So we haven't seen a proven second time infection, which is really a positive thing to hold on to.
Okay. Maybe that's our cue to go out on a relatively encouraging note, because we haven't had a lot in the last few months. I've been watching the number of people listening to us as we talk, and something unusual has been happening. The audience has been getting bigger over the course of the hour. I imagine people excitedly texting their friends and saying, "Hey, you got to hear Hankins and Naylor. They're giving us the real time." But that time is up. I want to thank you, Catherine Hankins from McGill University, David Naylor from the University of Toronto, for being so generous with your time and your wisdom tonight. And I want to thank our sponsors of the Canadian Bankers Association, our partners at the National Arts Centre, and everyone here at Maclean's Live for helping to bring you this conversation. And thanks to you, of course, at home for listening in. Have a safe summer. Keep your distance, wash your hands, be gentle to your neighbors and kind to your friends and strangers. And we'll see you all back in the fall. Thanks, everyone, and good night.